Now going to question 16, we always start with the prompt, and here the prompt tells us that this is a grammar question. So let's read for grammar. A conceptual artist and designer embraced by both the art world and the fashion world, Mary Ping was chosen to curate the exhibition Front Row Chinese American Designers for the Museum of Chinese in America. One thing we definitely want to notice here is that there's a long intro being used for the name of the exhibition. Now, the long intro, once again, is one of the ways that we can name a person or a thing. For instance, SAT instructor Alex Torres is nice. The long intro is the idea of combining all the info about the person or the thing with the name with no commas. And so this is essentially like saying Alex is nice. Obviously, that's as opposed to doing it as a middle modifier. The SAT instructor, Alex Torres, is nice. The modifier can only be used if you're able to delete the modifier and the rest of the sentence works well. So here we have a long intro being used to describe the exhibition, and we need to be okay with that so the sentence will make more sense when we're reading it. So she was chosen to curate the exhibition Front Row Chinese American Designers for the Museum of Chinese in America. So the purpose of understanding it as a long intro is that this entire thing, the exhibition Front Row Chinese American Designers, is read as one quick thing, and we try our best in our minds to not pause when we're reading it. So she was chosen to curate the exhibition Front Row Chinese American Designers for the Museum of Chinese in America. That's really the way to read it, because the idea of the long intro is that we're not actually pausing. So now that we are comfortable with that, let's try to figure out what would work well in the actual space that we're dealing with here. And to do that, let's talk about some true grammar fundamentals of what is a clause and what is a modifier. So a clause is something that has a subject and a verb. John jumped. Jumped is the verb. John is the person who did the verb. By the way, you can have a dependent clause since John jumped. If you add a weak conjunction like since to the front, now we can't really put a period anymore because it would sound so funny to say since John jumped and then not to continue after that. You have to have some other thing that will later say what happens since John jumped, he now has a headache or something like that. Now that's a clause. A modifier, on the other hand, is missing the subject, the verb, or both. So for instance, while jumping, ing words are not verbs, and there's no mention of John or he there. And you can have one in the middle of the sentence or one at the end of the sentence, but all of these are missing both the subject and the verb. But to be a modifier, all you need to be missing is one of those two things, the subject, the verb, or even both. So coming back to the sentence now, we're starting with a modifier, a conceptual artist and designer embraced by both the art world and the fashion world. So we're missing the subject-verb combination. For instance, she was a conceptual artist. That would make this a clause. But missing that part at the beginning, now it's a modifier. So we know we're starting with a modifier. And I want you to notice that there's also the element that we refer to as the stylish deletion of words, a conceptual artist and designer who was embraced. So in this situation, the who was is kind of implied in there. And so you see a lot of that kind of writing, and it's something you want to also get used to so that you can be comfortable reading this SAT style of writing. But the lack of the who was kind of really solidifies the fact that that first part is a modifier. So let's just go ahead and just delete all of our highlighting for a second. And we're going to highlight this part and say, okay, a conceptual artist and designer embraced by the art world and the fashion world. That's our modifier. Now, every sentence needs one independent clause. So if we're starting with a modifier and there's only one other part, we kind of know this must be the independent clause. Mary Ping was chosen to curate the exhibition for the Museum of Chinese in America. So here we have our subject, Mary Ping, our verb, was. Now here the word was is a verb. You want to really be aware that there are some special verbs you have to know about. Is, was, are, am, were, be, have, has, had. These are the most common verbs you're going to see, and they're easy to ignore. And if it's this important to be able to identify the difference between a clause and a modifier, then the verb becomes even more important because you need a subject and a verb to be a clause. In any case, this blue part is our independent clause. So we have a modifier followed by an independent clause. Modifiers are separated from the rest of the sentence by commas, so that's answer choice D here. Just to go through some of the wrong answer choices and why they're wrong. For a colon, the first part has to be independent and the second part describes the first part. And we know we don't have an independent clause in green because we talked about how that's a modifier. So we can't have a colon. For a semicolon, like C, you need two independent clauses, which also implies that the first part is an independent clause. And like I just said a moment ago, we know for a fact that green part is not an independent clause. We talked about that already. And A would just be incredibly awkward to have no punctuation whatsoever between the green and the blue parts. Just sounds terrible and doesn't follow any rules of grammar, which makes it a little extra hard to explain why it's wrong. But in any case, the answer here is D.